last video, I talked about the Aristotelian picture of matter and how matter relates to other bits of matter, that is, how causal relations work. This video, we're going to talk about kind of the downfall of that view, which in an important sense opens the way for the development of modern science. So the downfall of Aristotle kind of opens the door for a new and interesting view of how matter works that turns out to be a very powerful way of seeing the natural world that contributed to the development of the kind of scientific revolution. Okay, so very briefly, I'll just remind you, a couple main points from Aristotle, which were that he thought that you could, via careful observation under the right conditions, you could come to know the form of things. So he's a kind of direct realist about perception of the world. And if you came to know the form of a thing, that means that it would literally inform your mind. That is, you'd have a copy of the form of the thing in your brain. Or, well, he thought it was your heart, but whatever. So you know in some sense, the essence of a thing directly using careful systematic perception for Aristotle. And that direct perception gives you a very kind of deep and certain knowledge about how it's going to behave under various circumstances. So when we see a rock sinking in water, if you've properly observed the natural world, Aristotle thinks that you know that it's necessary that the rock sink in the water. That is, it couldn't have been any other way. Okay, so that's the Aristotelian picture. Now let's look at a critique of it. So we're going to look at Al-Ghazali's critique, but let me do some context setting before we get there. So we talked, of course, about how Aristotle's work got transmitted into the Islamic world. It's more or less lost in Western Europe at this point, but it's being intensely interrogated in the Islamic world. There's a really serious conversation going on about what parts of Aristotle are compatible with Islam. So there's some points at which it doesn't seem like you can both be an Islamic philosopher and an Aristotelian. And so that's the kind of background conversation where people are trying to suss out how much of Aristotle can be integrated without compromising their faith. And there were there were a bunch of different groups, but let's pick out just two to talk about, Falsafah and Kalam. So if you recall these from before, I believe I just briefly mentioned this, but as the translation movement picks up speed, and in fact, before this, while it was a less systematic but still ongoing effort to bring a bunch of ancient texts into the Islamic world, there were all kinds of sort of important ideas being brought in. And the material coming straight out of the Aristotelian tradition, like logic and science and philosophy, was called Falsafah. So people who were studying and in fact trying to advance the kind of philosophical projects from the Aristotelian tradition were called Falsafah, after philosopher. And there was another tradition which really didn't try to start from the position of philosophy or science, but rather from the position of theology. But their interest was in doing kind of rational theology. That is, trying to come up with good arguments and explanations for their theological views, which would sort of bolster them. And that's called Kalam. So it's a kind of theological work, but done through rational argumentation. And Falsafah and Kalam didn't always get along. They had a series of complex debates, including a bunch of other partners, but there's this ongoing sort of tension in the Islamic world between these two groups. Okay. So on the nature of God, just quickly, one of the big differences between the context in which Aristotle was writing and the context in which people were thinking about this stuff in the kind of early Islamic world had to do with the nature of God. So in the Greek Hellenistic world, God was not understood in the way that you would from a kind of monotheistic perspective. There's a bunch of gods in ancient Greek Hellenistic thinking, and none of them correspond to the idea of an all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing God. Plato and Aristotle have broadly different pictures of God. We don't really need to get into it too deeply. Plato thought that there was a demiurge, that is to say, a being that crafted the world like a craftsman. But this wasn't sort of the ultimate power of the universe. It was just the craftsman who put together our world. Aristotle talked about the unmoved mover. He got to from a series of arguments that there must be something at the beginning of time that moved everything that wasn't itself moved. He thinks this thing has got to be good and it's got to be wise, but it doesn't really pay too much attention to us. So the unmoved mover is unlike the notion of a God from a monotheistic religion, because it's not in our business all the time. So it's not particularly worried about us, even though it's sort of full of love and wisdom. Compare that to a monotheistic God, so the God from, say, Judaism or Islam or Christianity. So in those three traditions, God is a much more significant thing. So the idea of God in a monotheistic religion gets elevated to something much more powerful than the ancient Greeks had in mind. That is typically, or at least I'm certain of this in Christianity and Islam, God is all-knowing, all-seeing, and all-powerful. So there's no limits to the sort of power and magnificence of God in these ways of thinking. And that turns out to actually put constraints, to bring it back around to science, that puts constraints on how you can think about causes in the natural world. So, for example, Aristotle said that the rock necessarily sinks in water. But, for example, if God is all-powerful, couldn't he make it such that the rock didn't sink in the water? Saying that those causes are necessary is saying that they just couldn't have been otherwise. There's no possibility of it going any other way. But if God's all-powerful, presumably God can do whatever he wants. So this was understood by the sort of Kalam tradition as a kind of limit on the power of God that was unacceptable. So their picture of God made it unacceptable to say that there were limits on his power. So that's the kind of critique that we get from the Kalam of Falsafah. There's a whole bunch of them. It's a really rich and interesting story, so I hope you get to look into this on your own sometime, but we'll just sort of do a couple highlights. So let's talk about Al-Ghazali for a bit. Okay, so Al-Ghazali is one of the people that's probably most responsible for exploding the Aristotelian worldview. If you had to pick somebody, he's pretty high up on the list. Which means he's one of the people that's responsible for opening the door to modern science as we get out from under the Aristotelian way of seeing things. Although he probably wouldn't have seen that as one of his goals or particularly desirable. He studied, as a young man, philosophy and theology. He becomes a professor at one of the most prominent schools in Baghdad. So he's deeply immersed in this debate, all sides of this debate. However, in 1095, something happened to Al-Ghazali, which happens to a lot of people who study philosophy, actually. He had a kind of existential crisis. So he left his job, he gave away his money, he traveled around for a couple of years before kind of going into seclusion and trying to sort himself out. Something happened to him that is unfortunately fairly common amongst people who are sort of deeply interested or immersed in philosophy, which is that he started to become overwhelmed with skepticism, with doubt. So he started to doubt how we can know anything at all. And given the kind of philosophy he had been studying, which comes from the Aristotelian tradition, I think it's not hard to see why he went through this. Let me try to explain why I think this might have happened. So, I talked about how Aristotelians thought that causal relationships are necessary. This comes also associated with an idea about how explanations work. So Aristotle thought explanations should be deductive. That is, you can derive the conclusion that something's going to happen with certainty if you know the relevant thing. So if you know this is a rock and this is water, and you know the essence or form of those things, then what you know is that it's certain the rock is certainly going to sink in the water. So these essence-based explanations, these explanations based on things that make the thing what it is, or the very rockiness of the rock, or the very wateriness of the water, means that you should be able to come up with like necessary explanations for why things are the way they are. But when you start thinking hard about this stuff, and you really have a clear picture, so they have a quite sophisticated system of logic. Ultimately inherited from Aristotle, but improved on since then. So they're doing a lot of careful work in logic. They're doing a lot of careful work thinking about how knowledge works and where it comes from. And to give you their conclusion, when you start thinking about this stuff real carefully, it turns out to be very, very hard to give an explanation that's actually certain, that actually results in certainty. So I don't know if there even are any explanations that result in logical certainty. So if that's your standard for what counts as explaining or understanding or knowing about the world, that you're supposed to know it with certainty, which is pretty much what the Aristotelians were saying, well, life's going to be pretty disappointing for you because you don't know stuff with certainty, frankly. Like if you the more you kind of carefully think about it, the more obvious it is that there's nothing certain available to us, at least not through your senses, at least not through science. So Al-Ghazali gets out of his crisis of sort of existential crisis, you might call it, by having a kind of return to faith. So he switches out trying to find certainty in the natural world for finding it through his connection to the divine. So he's comes out of this with a kind of reinvigorated faith in Islam. And for him, that kind of, he's not trying to do rational theology at this point. He's saying, look, I have a kind of direct knowledge of these articles of my faith that doesn't need to be argued for or justified. So there, he got his certainty, but he didn't get it through logical deductions or careful observation of the natural world. He got it through faith, essentially. Having come out of this crisis, he then goes back to the conversations he was having before with a kind of new, keen eye. And he provided this quite cutting critique of the Aristotelian picture. So he asks the following question. Is it necessary this is a little picture of cotton on fire, if you put a flame to cotton, is it necessary that it burns? Another way of putting this is it possible that you could put a match to a little fluffy, dry piece of cotton, but it doesn't burn? And Al-Ghazali says, I think it's possible. I can picture that. I can imagine it. Yeah, I mean, every time I've done that in the past, it's gone up in flames, but where's the impossibility in putting fire to cotton and it not burning? I don't see that impossibility. And notice that you don't see that necessity with your eyes, right? There's nothing in your sensory experience that tells you that it's strictly necessary that cotton's going to catch fire. What you see is that it happened yesterday and had happened today, and you can guess that it'll happen tomorrow. But that necessary content of your experience that Aristotle was telling us is there, Al-Ghazali looks at himself and says, I don't see it. Do you see it? If you can see the necessity in this connection, let me know, because it doesn't appear anywhere in my senses. So it's a really fascinatingly powerful critique that is essentially just Al-Ghazali asking a question. Where's the necessity of this coming from? And nobody seems to have a good answer to that. I mean, the consensus right now is that you can't sort of detect the necessity of causal connections just by looking at them. So causal connections on this view aren't necessary. They're the opposite of that, which is contingent, which is to say they could have been otherwise. So if something is contingent, it could have gone another way. There's at least a possibility that it could have been otherwise than it was. So, Al-Ghazali's got this critique of the kind of necessity that's supposed to attach to causes in the Aristotelian picture. People think it's pretty impressive. I think it's pretty impressive. And in fact, a very similar critique is made by David Hume centuries later. He gets much more credit for it, but Al-Ghazali's works very nicely. He's also a subscriber, to bring this back to atomism, to a view called Occasionalism. So he didn't come up with this. This was the kind of overall view of the school of theology of which he was a member. So his teacher taught him this, but he was a subscriber to it. So this is the view that the physical world, in some sense, isn't governed by laws. So there's not like rules in the physical world itself. Rather, the regularities that we observe are the result of the will of God. Okay, so suppose you're playing billiards and you hit the cue ball into the rack and all the other balls go flying. One way of seeing that is that there's some kind of physical necessity. There's laws of nature that require that the other balls go scattering or whatever. But of course, you can imagine. I think it's not beyond imagination to picture, the cue ball hitting the rack and just stopping dead, right? Just nothing happening. You can imagine it, right? And the occasionalist says that's not just imaginable; it's really possible. Like, it really could be the case that things don't do what they usually do in their normal causal relationships. It's a causal relationship between the cue ball and the other balls. Usually when one smacks into the other, they all go flying, but maybe it could be the case that one day it just wouldn't. So the occasionalists think that the fact that, every time in my entire life I've seen the cue ball hit another ball, it hasn't just stopped dead. Something has happened and bounced off and bounced around the table. And the occasionalists think that that's because every time you think you see two things physically interacting, God is stepping in to create that apparent interactions. So when I hit a cue ball, or if I flip the light switch, or any of the things that kind of normally cause one thing causing another, in every single one of those cases, it's God's will stepping in and allowing that causal connection to apparently happen. It's not really connecting. So if I hit the cue ball and another ball goes flying, it's not really the cue ball causing the other ball to go flying. It's God allowing it to happen. So God's intervening literally every time two things seem to be interacting. You can see how this flows from the idea of an all-powerful monotheistic God, where God has, saying that the physical connections between things are necessary limits the power of God. Well, here's a picture that maximizes the power of God. There's no limit here to what God can do. It's just the most involved God could possibly be in the universe. Okay, so there's a view. Occasionalism also comes up in the philosophy of mind, but we'll set that aside. It's pretty standard in current philosophy of science to think that if you're explaining something by citing God, that's probably not a great explanation. The problem is that if you accept something like God did it as a good explanation, if you think God did it is a fine explanation, there's kind of no limits to how much you can explain that way. So you could explain literally anything by God did it, and you don't necessarily learn that much about the world that way. So you can really kind of close off questions without building much understanding about what's going on. So, okay, so how does this lead to anything resembling modern science? So how is Al-Ghazali's critique, where he sort of knocks down the apparent necessity of causal relations, how does that help us get anywhere towards science? Because it looks like we're going further away at this point. I think the crucial thing here is breaking out of the kind of direct or naive realism that characterized Aristotelian philosophy. So the real breakthrough is to doubt that the inner operations of the world are apparent, that they're intuitive, that we should be able to grasp them easily, rationally, and that they should be presented to our senses in a fairly straightforward way. So again, for Aristotle, the world is very directly knowable. You look at it with a clear mind and a uninterrupted medium between you, and nothing weird is going on. You're just making careful observations of the world. You really know the world in a deep and profound way. But Al-Ghazali's picture of how causes work and his critique of this kind of picture of necessary causal connections that we can rationally apprehend opens the question of, like, what if the world is just way, way weirder than we thought it was? Less intuitive, less transparent to our senses. And I would suggest that having an attitude of, well, maybe the world is much stranger than we thought is actually powerfully conducive to modern science. So, for example, Aristotle's work is full of observations. He was a particularly good marine biologist, so he does tons and tons of observations of the natural world. But what's missing from Aristotle are experiments. He doesn't do a bunch of experiments. Experiments, you might say, are kind of unnatural. So you set up this really contrived situation where you're excluding a bunch of variables, you're setting things up in a very specific, particular, fiddly way. From the Aristotelian perspective, you're not studying nature there. You're studying some weird, bodged together setup. Studying nature means studying it in nature. So Aristotle makes a distinction between the kind of natural and violent motions, for example. So the natural motion of a rock is to fall. You can impart violent motion of the rock. If you throw it up, you'll whip a rock up in the air. It won't immediately start falling. It'll sail a bit. But that for him wasn't in the nature of the rock. And understanding, deep understanding, is understanding its nature. So for Aristotle, what we want to get at is the natural motions of things, not the kind of violent motions. In an experiment, what we're doing is creating a highly artificial situation where you're not letting things naturally run their course, right? You're doing some kind of careful and often very elaborate intervention on things because what you think is maybe the normal operation of the world isn't enough for us to get at the kind of deep causal structure of things. You doubt, when you're setting up an experiment, you doubt that you can just sort of straightforwardly, with your ordinary senses in an ordinary situation, really understand what's deeply happening with something. What you need to do is probe it in a huge variety of ways, typically. So I would suggest that the breakdown of the kind of Aristotelian picture opens up the way to a much more experimental approach to nature, because the causes are hidden, they're obscure, they're not just sitting on the face of things. Okay, so back to Bala. So in keeping with his kind of overall thesis, Bala's argument in this chapter is that the kind of ancient Greek atomists that I talked about in the other video are unlikely to have been the direct or the only influence on atomism in modern Europe. So he thinks that thinkers from the Islamic world like Averroes and Maimonides are extremely likely to have been read by people who become atomists after or during the scientific revolution, and therefore the kind of critique that we see in Al-Ghazali and a bunch of other Islamic thinkers is extremely likely to have influenced modern atomism. So to bring this back to the topic for the week, which I haven't talked much about this week, which is mechanism. What does any of this have to do with mechanism? Okay, so one of the central ideas of the mechanical philosophy that becomes the kind of cutting edge philosophy of the scientific revolution is that everything should be explained in terms of strictly one kind of explanation, stuff pushing or pulling, right? Just sort of physically, objects bouncing off each other. That's the only kind of explanation we want. And if you recall, Aristotle had a few different types of explanation, like explaining things in terms of their goal. The mechanists say, no, that's out. Okay, so for atomists, there's really only one kind of stuff in the universe, the atoms. And maybe those atoms have slightly different shapes, but that stuff, those atoms, really only have one kind of causal power, which is bumping into each other. Or maybe if you got one with like a hook shape on it, you can pull another atom, something like that. So together, atomism and mechanism form this really nice kind of cooperative enterprise to essentially overthrow both the Aristotelian picture of matter and of how we should explain things. So that's the kind of connection with mechanism, essentially that atomism and mechanism fit really nicely together. Okay, that's it for this week.